I don't want to spend a lot of time on introductions, but I do want to just frame this panel. This is work that the three of us, we've been talking about this issue quite a bit. We all work here at the LBJ School and are all involved in different evaluation projects of various types of programs. And we have lots of thoughts about them. I'm going to spend some time talking about a home visiting evaluation that I'm doing, but really just kind of what are the potential risks that using an evidence-based policy approach, what should we be thinking about as we kind of move down that path? Paul von Hippel is going to share his experiences. He's worked both in banking and in the academy, and he's going to really help to highlight some of the differences that you see across both the private and then the social science use of evidence. And Carolyn Heinrich, whose birthday it is today, she is truly an expert in evaluation research and in working with communities and states and at the federal level of helping to make sure that folks meet the performance measures that they want, that they don't just use one RCT and go home, but that they really learn how to use evidence effectively and ensure its success. So I'm glad that we are going to have this discussion. We'll have time for questions. So, so things are going to look different up on the slides than they do on my slides, so I might, I'm not sure exactly what you're going to see. Anyway, I'm going to provide, again, a case study from a home visiting evaluation that we've been doing. And I just want to begin by saying that I truly believe that the evidence-based policymaking approach is the right one. As a social scientist, I have to say we've been waiting for this for years. We always complain that no one listens to the work that we do. And so that the idea that the administration and that policymakers are interested in social science research to guide them is such a, it's really a treat. And as Ron Haskins said, home visiting is one of the areas that has really embraced this in kind of beyond many of the other programs. And I would say that we have more evidence in home visiting than in some of the other programs, and it shows that of all the early childhood interventions that we have, this is really one of the most promising. But there are potential risks that threaten the success of using evidence to kind of guide this approach. And I think that one of the first things that we have noticed, kind of the risk that we see, is that we hear folks using home visiting to address kind of any problem that they have, any outcome that they have. And we believe that all of our programs will work for all of our families for just about any outcome. And I think that that is a risk, and it's important that we know what the programs can and cannot do. This is one of those slides that I actually hate as well, like Ron said, but I don't want you to really read the slide. I just want you to see that of the 4 home visiting program models that we're using here in Texas as part of our federally funded programs, that they vary in terms of the types of outcomes that they have both been effective at impacting and that they've even measured. So some programs are favorable across multiple outcomes. Some are good at addressing one set of outcomes. Some haven't measured them all. And so it's really important that you choose a program model that really has demonstrated impacts for the outcomes that you want to change. You don't want to pick a program model that is really good at increasing learning outcomes for kids to affect child maltreatment if it hasn't shown effects there. And sometimes we're not understanding as much of what our program models can do. And I think that the other potential risk is that we set unrealistic expectations for these programs. They do work, and most of the evidence is fairly rigorous. But our results that we have across our programs are fairly modest. Like Ron said, if you, for researchers here, if you get a 20% of a standard deviation on any sort of outcome, you're thinking, well, that's great, because that's pretty much all that you're ever going to get. But it's hard sometimes to really detect those outcomes at a large level and to replicate them. And many of our outcomes have been shown to only work on our hardest to serve populations. So we set pretty high expectations. I'm not going to go through all of these, but President Obama has said that this evidence-based home visiting has been critical in improving the maternal and child health outcomes, long-lasting positive impacts. The Pew Charitable Trust led a 10-year campaign and is really very responsible for motivating at the state level the use of evidence-based programs. And they even concede that they might have championed it just a little bit louder than the evidence warranted early on. But that they have to invest in these quality evidence-based home visiting programs. Our taxpayers are going to reap the benefits. Here in Texas, we have had folks say this is actually, it works. It's a conservative idea. It will make a big difference for our future. They're going to be much more educated, much more highly educated. Right? So people believe strongly, and Nick Kristof actually in his pretty recent New York Times column used the word stunningly effective evidence, the results for these that will pay for itself several times over. So I don't want to spend any time really looking at these numbers. I just want to kind of point out that the evidence that we have, again, is fairly modest. No program can do all things, and we have to be realistic about what we should be expecting. This is just a couple of different outcomes that we chose, and some of the things that are important to see is that not every program model that's measured these things have found the same sorts of outcomes. And when we do, we sometimes see pretty big increases, but not always are significant results substantial. This is looking at breastfeeding, and one of the program models has shown an increase in the proportion who have ever breastfeed, an increase from 16 to 26%. Well, that's 2/3 increase. That's a big number, but still the number is 26% that are breastfeeding. Here's all the different program models that have looked at well-child visits and immunizations, and we have one program model that has shown a really significant increase, and that one is pretty substantial. This is in our learning supports. These are mostly kind of cognitive outcomes, things that children would be having access to books in the home and other resources in the home. Again, please don't try to even think about reading all these numbers here, but you can see lots of programs have shown impacts here, but highlighted in the red indicates that it was for the most disadvantaged groups that the programs have worked, not for all of the groups. Child maltreatment is also one that has shown lots of effects, but again, the red shows that it's mostly for our most disadvantaged groups. So I just want to reiterate how important it is to remember that home visiting or any program is not a silver bullet. It won't do all things. There's nothing that ever can, but it is a really important element in a host of services that support children and families. So the other thing that is a potential risk is that we forget that RCTs are what we call a guide, but not a guarantee. And Ron talked about this a lot, and I just think it merits reiterating that the results that we get from a random controlled trial will vary widely, the results that we've seen, even within program models. So each random controlled trial is really one sample from a population, and when you do that again on a different population or a different time period and so forth, you are likely to get different results. And we've seen that in almost all the program models that we have. And what we need, like Ron said, is to continue to evaluate and to see the kind of, does this program work across multiple populations? And as we take our programs to scale and out of the kind of carefully controlled random controlled trials into the real world, which is where most of you live and work, it becomes even messier and harder to maintain the same outcomes that you would see. And I'm not going to go through this. Ron touched on these kind of really important issues of implementation, but things do change a lot from what you might have seen in the random control trial to what you're going to see on the ground. You have differences in the motivation for implementing these programs. Some people are doing it because they need the money and they want to offer services to families. They're not wedded to a particular program model themselves. Some have been doing this for a long time, and some couldn't spell NFP or PAT or HIPPY or any of the others before they started to do it. It's also really important to note how different the population characteristics might be, and that might affect our outcomes. When we look, again, too many things up here, but really just what I wanted to point out is our program models have been tested on a wide variety of populations, but within a study, there's sometimes a dominant race or ethnic group. So for instance, our NFP model that shows lots of impacts from our Memphis study was tested predominantly on African Americans. And another study, which had different outcomes from our Denver study, was a more heterogeneous population. And the outcomes were not the same across populations. So just within a program model, when you do the program in different populations, you are likely to get different results. And it's something that we just have to keep in mind. I will spend more time talking about fidelity to the model in our third panel, but I really think that this is something that we have to pay attention to, and we have to answer the question of who's responsible for fidelity to the model. Is it the program models that are training and getting funding for it, or is it the implementers? And I could spend too much time on data quality. But I just wanted to, those were on my slide, not yours, I went through already. But I just wanted to show you just what the variation is looking like across Texas. We took a limited sample of those, or some of our larger programs, and looked at when the parents have actually been in the program for a longer period of time. But you can see that of our nurse-family partnership, in their random control trial, they really did see a big difference in breastfeeding from 16% in the control group to 26% in the treatment group. And you can see that our communities across Texas, some are doing much better than the treatment group that NFP study found, and some are not doing quite as strongly. But there's a lot of variation, and that's to be expected. And again, this learning from why it's working is really going to be important. This is our outcome of reading daily to your child, and so we have all 4 program models in here. And this is the early Head Start treatment versus control. You can see that there were gains in the treatment group as compared to the control group. And you can see that even within our communities, these are each of the communities that are implementing these, there's large variation in the proportion that are reading daily. And all the same color bars are the same program. So all the dark blue bars represent one program. And you can see there's a lot of variation there. So you should expect variation. RCTs are a guide, not a guarantee of what you're going to get. And just to reemphasize how important it is to understand why programs aren't working, not just whether they're working, but why and how we can improve them. I just want to finish up by saying that it's really important that we don't stop innovating. That Ron spoke of this, so I don't need to speak long on this topic, but the programs that are on these approved lists, they're the programs, they're not the only programs that work. They're the ones that have been tested. There are things out there that you're doing that you know about that have not yet been tested, but they probably do work. Some of the programs that are on the list may not be on the list for very long. They may not work as well. But we really do have to continue to innovate. And we have to be receptive to the new challenges that our kids are facing. Some of our program models were developed quite a while ago. Take Nurse-Family Partnership as an example, and I don't mean, it's one of our strongest programs, I do not mean to bash it at all, but one of its early goals was to reduce smoking during the prenatal period. Well, that's not really one of our major problems anymore. It is a big problem, but not as big. But we don't have any of our programs today who are really targeting childhood obesity that begins in infancy. And that is a really big problem that we have. So our new challenges will arise, and we need to make sure that we're ready to face them. So again, continue to evaluate our evidence-based programs, not just asking whether they work, but why, for whom, how can they work better, what do they need to do to change. So I'm going to stop here and hand it over to Paul. But I'm hoping that we'll be able to have time to come back during our discussion period to hear your reflections. Thank you.
It'll start. Wonderful, thank you. That's my book.
This is for you. Do you want it?
Thank you.
Let's see. There you go.
Great.
Thanks. I'm going to sit over here so I can see better.
Nice job. Thank you.
Oh,
Let's see.
well, we didn't need that anyway, did we?
I think, let me check back here.
Oh, here we go.
Oh, you got it? Okay.
So I have an unusual background that I thought gave me an unusual opportunity to share some of what I've learned. Before I came to the LBJ school, I worked for 4 years in banking, where I developed, I was what's now called a data scientist. I wish I had such a cool title back then. And I developed fraud detection scores, first for internet banking and later for checking and debit cards. And I did a lot of evaluation of scores and strategies that were being developed internally at different banks and provided by vendors. And since then, since I've been at the LBJ school, I've been involved in several program evaluations, including an evaluation of year-round school calendars, mostly in California and other Western states. Also, with Cynthia and Jane Lincove, I worked on an evaluation of all the teacher preparation programs in Texas, comparing their impacts on children's test scores. And I've also worked on an evaluation of a child obesity prevention program called Texas Fitness Now. And it's been interesting to me to see the contrast between the way that evidence is used in business and the way that it's used in policy. In some ways, the business culture of evidence is far ahead of what exists in government currently, and so I think the contrast can give us some idea of what we're working toward. And, oh, I should be advancing these slides, shouldn't I?
There you go. It is nice when they're in front of you like that, but.
What's going on in business can give us some idea of what a more sort of mature evidence-based culture looks like, what we might aspire to. One thing I noticed, and this kind of drove me crazy when I first encountered it, is that businesses are really reluctant to generalize. So there might be a strategy that's in use at Bank of America, and people at JP Morgan, Chase, or Wells Fargo will say, well, there's no guarantee that it'll work here. We need to evaluate it internally. Or when a bank goes through an acquisition, all the bank's policies, all the policies of both the acquired bank and the acquiring bank are called into question because you don't know whether the policies will generalize from one portfolio to another. The fact that a policy worked last year doesn't mean that it will continue to work this year, especially in an area like fraud control, which is somewhat dynamic, where the behaviors of fraudsters are changing in response to the strategy that the banks have used to date. So there's a reluctance to generalize, and evidence is continually collected even on established policies to see if they're still working. And if a new policy is proposed, a really mature evidence-based organization will do what's called, in Six Sigma methodology, a champion-challenger test or an A/B test, which means that we're going to continue doing what we're doing, but we're going to isolate a 5% fraction of our customers and try the new strategy on them and compare the two. So there are a lot of randomized controlled trials going on that you're currently participating in simply as customers of big banks or users of Facebook or users of Google. Google does 10,000 experiments a year to optimize the search results that they give you. So there's a lot of this going on, and there's a culture of continuous improvement. Governments, in contrast, seem to generalize all too willingly. So in the area of early childhood programs and pre-Ks, one of the most famous pre-Ks is the Perry Preschool, which was a preschool that served 58 children in Ypsilanti, Michigan in the 1960s and was contrasted with a random control group of similar size. The Perry Preschool appears to have had large impacts on students in later life, and when those impacts were first publicized in the 1990s, it led some people to jump to the conclusion that Head Start must be a really effective program in terms of its long-term impacts. But that's not necessarily the case at all. There are different programs working with different cohorts of children. Another example is we have a sort of touching faith that child obesity can be reduced by physical activity in schools. And in part, it's popular policy because the alternative seems to be confronting large entrenched interests like the Kellogg's Corporation about their food marketing policies. We'd rather not do that, so let's continue to focus on school physical education. And the evidence on school physical education, its effect on obesity, is mixed at best. As just one example of what the mixed evidence looks like, the CATCH program, which is the most popular obesity reduction program in the state of Texas and growing and popular in other states as well, there have been 2 formal evaluations of CATCH. There was a big randomized study in 4 different states in 1994 that found that the effect of CATCH on obesity was not just 0, but 0.0. That was a randomized study. More recently, there was another study. It was in El Paso only. It was not randomized, but it did use matching, so there was some level of rigor there, which suggested that the program was being successful in that area, and it might have been. And so what we don't know currently is whether CATCH is effective in the hundreds of locations where it's implemented in Texas. It's not being systematically evaluated in any of those locations. And so it's sort of a matter of faith whether you think that the results of the 1994 evaluation or the 2005 evaluation are more typical of what we're currently seeing in Texas. We just don't know. And that's a shame because evaluation is relatively inexpensive compared to program costs. Another contrast that I've noticed is that in businesses, evidence is really integrated into decision making. So when a vendor comes with a new strategy or score or data source that they're proposing might benefit a business, the business backtests that in archival data and might roll it out to a random sample of the population. And on the basis of those tests, I mean, I don't want to say politics aren't important in business because they are, but there's an important role for what were the results of the tests that we did in terms of determining whether we're going to purchase services from this vendor. And I've seen people lose their jobs in banking because a particular initiative that they championed didn't work out. Whereas in policy work, it seems like there's the process of decision making is much less integrated with the process of research. So government decisions are made on the basis of annual budgets, biannual legislative sessions in Texas, whereas when you do evaluation work, you're often dictated by what the calendars are of the programs that you're evaluating, by what grant cycles look like, and by journal review deadlines, or journal review decisions. So just to give you an example, oh yes, I'm sorry, thank you. It's just what I'm saying up there. I don't have interesting visuals for this talk.
That's what I figured.
So as an example of a kind of disconnect between the evaluation cycle and the policy cycle, is Texas Fitness Now, which is a program that I evaluated with Kyle Bradbury, who's here. Kyle started this work when he was a master's student here, and now he's a staff researcher. The Texas legislator, and I should say, by the way, I was going to say this when I get to the budget part, that the work was funded by the evaluation work was funded by the St. David's Foundation, and the program officer, Becky Passner, who gave us the money, hi Becky, is here. So the Texas, to give you some idea of the history and sort of the relative integration or lack of integration of evaluation, the Texas legislature authorized Texas Fitness Now in 2007. They renewed it in 2009. And expanded it, in fact, to serve more schools. And then they terminated it in 2011. And none of these decisions were based on evidence. The 2011 decision to terminate it was not based on the idea that the program was ineffective, but was based on just the general budget crunch that was happening there. It was a program that had fewer friends than some others. And so they spent a total of $37 million on it over a course of 4 years without any real evidence on whether it was working or not, even when the decision to terminate it came up. Kyle and I evaluated the program. We started it in 2014. We had a budget of $25,000 from the St. David's Foundation. We probably ended up spending about twice that much on it. So we were basically evaluating the program after it had already been authorized, reauthorized, and terminated. And only now are we going to find out whether it worked out. And the horrible irony of this is that I can't even tell you what we found because it's under a journal embargo. As academics, we have to seek peer-reviewed publications, so there's a journal that's interested in it, and they don't want us releasing the results until they publish them. So there's the feedback that's being provided to the people who authorized and reauthorized and terminated the program is not exactly timely in this case. Now this is a kind of, you could say, well, we're sort of freelancing, right? We're doing our own evaluation because we're interested in the program. The state government didn't ask us to do it. In fact, we got private funding to do it. But if you look at something like the Head Start Impact Study, which was in fact initiated by the federal government, the first recommendation for it was in 1998. It was launched in 2002. First and third grade data collection were completed in 2006 and 2008. There was a draft report that was completed on the first grade results in 2008. And then there were delays of 2 to 4 years until 2010 and 2012 when the public reports on the results were finally released. And this was partly because the results were disappointing to program advocates, both inside and outside the government. I claim that there's been little change to the program, but Ron's talk earlier educated me about that. There are apparently changes to the program that are responses to this evaluation, but it took an awfully long time between 1998 and 2015 to actually see the program respond to evidence, and that's, there really needs to be a tighter integration and a faster feedback loop. And the speed of the feedback loop, we have to think about what kind of time horizon that we're interested in. Businesses are sort of famous for being focused on a short time horizon, and that's both a strength and a weakness. So in the case of loans that banks make, for example, if you make a 30-year loan, if you make a 30-year mortgage loan, you don't necessarily have to wait 30 years to see if it's working out. Most loans that are going to default well before 30 years, and you see signs of stress before that. So banks talk about delinquencies, which are late payments, missed payments, payments that aren't payments in full. You see those kinds of signs early, and banks monitor that carefully and use that to decide whether they're going to intervene or whether they're going to write off, how much of their portfolio they're going to have to write off. This kind of thing can be a weakness as well as a strength, so a lot of businesses are sort of famous for not investing in research and development because the payback period is too long. And in the case of the banking crisis, of course, one of the sources of the banking crises was the idea of pushing these defaults off over the horizon that the banks were using to evaluate their risks. So a mortgage would be structured with a big balloon payment that wasn't due until 5 or 7 years out. And as a result, the bank looked great until that balloon payment came due, and then there were a whole wave of defaults. So the kind of short-term horizon has its weaknesses, but it also has a strength. In academia, there's been a recent wave of very interesting studies which involve linking early childhood interventions like preschool, the Perry Preschool, or class size reduction in Tennessee in the 1980s, to adult outcomes of the children who participate in these programs. You get to see what the impact is of an early childhood program on wages and incarceration and history of pregnancy in the teens and 20s. And these are really fascinating, but they provide really slow feedback to those programs. I mean, the Perry Preschool is not going to be modified on the basis of studies. The Perry Preschool, which was run in the 1960s, is not going to be modified on the basis of studies that were done in the 1990s. And class size reduction in Tennessee, which was conducted in the 1980s, is not affected by the studies that we're doing of it now. So, and there's also a kind of faith that people have that there are these sleeper effects, that even if you're not seeing short-term impacts of programs, maybe 20, 30 years down the line, we'll really see something. That's an interesting idea. I'm not sure how common it is, and I'm not sure how valuable that kind of thinking is to the building of an evidence-based culture where we really want to integrate the results of evaluations into ongoing improvements of programs. If you're going to do that, you need to have a time horizon that's less than 20 years and probably less than 5. So now I will turn this stopwatch and the podium over to my colleague, Carolyn Heinrich.
Thanks.
Thanks.
You may want to sit here so you can see better. Just move over.
That's my book for you to sign. That's my book for you to sign. Okay. All right, now I can get my stopwatch back on here. Okay, so Ron already sort of outed me as an economist, so let me just give you a little bit of background. When I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago, I had the privilege of studying under Jim Heckman, who won the Nobel Prize in 2000 for his work on non-experimental or quasi-experimental methods of evaluation. And at the time I was a graduate student learning with him, we were reanalyzing data from the National JTPA study, which was one of the first big federal experimental evaluations of employment training programs. One of the things I learned through that experience was that, a random assignment experiment, which and Ron and I are in the same mission, I agree with everything he says. A randomized experimental evaluation is considered, the gold standard because of this idea that we know exactly how people are assigned to treatments by chance. So that's the only thing that makes those who are treated and not treated different. But what we learned in reanalyzing those data, that there's still a lot of work done by people implementing the experiment, implementing the programs, and those who are subjected to the treatment that can lead to challenges in actually how it gets executed. So in this particular reanalysis of experimental data, it was found that there were some decisions made in how data were kind of codified and used, and then some things that happened where people who were not supposed to be treated actually did get treatment and vice versa. And it actually changed, once you corrected for some of those issues, actually changed the experimental results in important ways and had affected the population. So this was a case actually where, for example, when the first results from, I think, the first 18 months came out, it suggested that youth programs weren't effective. And I was in Chicago at the time and saw that the budgets got cut for youth funding for summer programs by 40%. Well, that reanalysis actually showed that there are actually positive impacts on net. That's a published piece of work you can look at. So we do have to be careful because if you really understand statistics, any randomized experiment is one draw from one population of this sample size and this site, and it's going to have limitations, possibility in how it's executed. Even if it's executed flawlessly, there could be other situations you try to do the same thing, as Cynthia and Ron were saying, you might not get those same results for a variety of reasons. It's really important evidence, but you have to be careful about benchmarking everything against those impacts, or taking that, like Cynthia was saying, assuming that we're going to see this result everywhere, we just have to do this. The other important thing I learned in the work I was doing was, so I was learning these methods and learning actually, so the quasi-experimental methods had kind of a bad rap because there had been previous studies that have suggested they didn't replicate experimental impact estimates very well when we could actually benchmark or compare the two. But we'd also learned a lot about how we could do them better. So the state of knowledge has significantly advanced. We also know there's no method du jour. We keep coming up with new experimental or quasi-experimental methods. They don't apply everywhere, depend a lot on the context of data. And also this idea that if people aren't randomly assigned to treatment, the most important thing we need to know is exactly how are they assigned to treatment, right? So if there are very clear processes that everybody follows, and we can actually model that, we get good enough data, we can actually do pretty well in understanding impacts. But we have to understand those contexts. So one of the things I learned as a graduate student by a project I was working on for the Cook County President's Office of Employment Training, getting out into the community, I learned so much about what was happening on the ground, why I needed to understand the context, who was implementing the programs, what decisions were being made, and also getting my hands dirty with the data. A lot of my economist colleagues work with big data sets and never get out of the office at the lab where they access them to actually see how those data were generated. I was fortunate in my graduate work to get into a warehouse in the west side of Chicago and dig up contracts I dusted off and codified data from to kind of appreciate things like this. These days we have so many more opportunities for evaluation because we do actually take and codify and now put into these incredibly powerful computers data that we weren't able, that I had to pull out of file folders years ago and code up. So we've got wonderful opportunities, but I've also come to, as I've done this work, appreciate more and more the limitations of our data and evidence. And one of the things I've come to appreciate is, like I said, I'm a complete believer in when we can do an experimental evaluation, that's great. But I also believe that alone is not enough. Ron mentioned earlier this book by Judy Garan and Howard Wellsting, Fighting for Reliable Evidence. And I love this quote from their book, because Judy and Howard both did a tremendous amount of work to get us doing more experimental evaluations in social science contexts, in the real world of social welfare policy making. And so this is a quote: "We always viewed random assignment design as a skeleton in which to build an evaluation that used multiple techniques to address a broader range of questions, including those raised by practitioners and managers, by researchers who use different methods to diagnose the problems and understand why people behave as they do and how social programs work in practice. They, program funders and government partners, cared about why program participants and managers behaved as they did, why programs were or were not successfully implemented, and what could be done to improve the results. That is not going to be achieved just by your random assignment design. We have to understand how things are working. Why did it work here and not work there? And that kind of data collection, I also believe now, should not just be separate from what we're trying to do in a more rigorous methods. The more we can connect them, the better. Let me give you an example, too. The other thing we have to realize is that another kind of fun thing I learned working with Professor Heckman, one of the subtitles of one of his papers were, "Better data help a lot." And so he was saying is a lot of this work we try to do in getting better methods is oftentimes trying to overcome limitations of our data. Well, we don't measure this. What can we do about that? I've also learned that sometimes we accept at face value too much that this is a measure of this, or this field or variable in my spreadsheet that I use to manage my program is representing this, or this common measure we use of free lunch status for kids in schools as disadvantaged has real limitations. Just to give you an example, I was doing a study for the Institute of Education Sciences, which is one of these institutions that's done wonderful work to promote more knowledge, evidence production, and the study included some very large school districts: Los Angeles, Chicago, Minneapolis, Milwaukee, Dallas. And we were studying intervention under No Child Left Behind, which if children were in schools that were consistently not making adequately early progress, parents and those students need to be given an option to get free tutoring, or they could transfer to another school. Very few took the transfers, most took free tutoring. So we were evaluating this initiative to see, is this free tutoring actually helping these kids to improve their learning? We found out that, we have this great treatment measure. All the districts have these providers who could be for-profit, nonprofits, others out in the community delivering services, and they all invoice the districts per hour of tutoring, right? That's great. Across the districts, I can have a common treatment measure. It's an invoiced hour of tutoring. Seems great. Well, then as we were in the districts, I got to learn a lot more about what is an invoiced hour of tutoring. So in Chicago public schools, for example, they would assign a child to get tutoring Monday, Wednesday, Friday for an hour and a half. The child signed in, checked box, that was an hour and a half of tutoring delivered. In other places, they would do spot checking. If the child stepped out, gone to football practice after halfway through the session, they had to stop and count that. We also saw really unusual patterns in the data where Milwaukee, for example, as we were analyzing the data, we saw, wow, all the providers here are kind of maximizing, you could bill up to a certain level per student. They're all maximizing how much, money they're getting. We kind of pointed this out unusual pattern. Would there be more of a distribution of the hours of tutoring for these kids? Well, they started cross-checking signatures across sessions, and 1 year later, those distributions all looked really normal. So there were a lot of flaws. And then we got into the schools, and we started observing sessions. We had an observation instrument we created to document what was happening, what kids were spending their time on. We found huge ranges within an hour by format, by setting, by who the tutor was, by whether they used digital or non-digital tutoring, and how much of that hour is actually instruction, right? And that's what we want to know. Is the instruction provided to these students increasing their learning? We had to net out the noise. So here you take what seems like from administrative data, great comparable measure. We found all kinds of differences across district settings. So just a caution that the better we know our evidence, the more cautiously we might treat it. Another important point, so getting out and working with those who are delivering the services, partnering, trying to figure out how to make this intervention work, has really been extremely valuable. And it's led me in my research to try to develop what I call two-way research partnerships, or what we've called research to practice collaboratives, various names. But the idea is that it really becomes two-way learning. As a researcher, I got a better understanding of the context, the issues that are faced, the challenges the practitioners face, and that actually sometimes redirects our research. We get a better handle on what is the most important question we should be asking here. We came in and we have to balance this with, I make a proposal to the Institute of Education Sciences. I have to lay out exactly my econometric models I'm going to estimate in order to get funded. But then I find out, wow, we really should be studying this. And I have to say to my program officers, okay, if I shift my resources, because this turns out to be an even more important question. And this doesn't happen like immediately. I go into, for example, I told you about this project with the school district. The second I go in there, don't say, oh, we're going to tell you all about this. We have to build relationships. We get into the field. We are working with them. We are understanding we're doing things like we saw, like I said, with Milwaukee Public Schools, looking at the data, brought this to their attention, allowed them to change practices that then gave them, in fact, better control over the delivery of the intervention and more efficiency and effectiveness. So the point is we have to develop these relationships with our research partners. You get two-way trust. They know that we're not just out there to say, I'm just going to report to the Institute of Education Sciences, your program worked or it didn't work. We want to work with them, understand what are those challenges to making this work. Evaluation research, in my opinion, is much more effective if we can figure out through our work what are those levers for making improvements, or what are the barriers to us seeing success. We may start with evidence-based model, but we may learn that we want to learn the ways in which its execution is actually going to drive results. And that happens from getting an understanding, like I said, what are those levers? What are those barriers? Who does this depend on making this work? We developed in this project I told you about, we called these research to practice collaboratives, where we would bring our research findings to the people in the districts, as Paul said, at the right time, before the school year started, when they were trying to make decisions on how they were going to change allocations, let's say, of funding or program features or priorities or this contract with this vendor. We would bring it to them, and then we'd have these discussions. And because we were in the field, we had more credibility. They knew we understood the issues that they were facing. We could also have this two-way discussion where they're saying, that's really important. Here's what we need to know besides that. And that helped us to redirect our research to make sure we were being responsive to the needs of the day. And as Cynthia was saying, they can change over time. Even policy implementation directives from the federal government were changing over time. So this quote from the Minneapolis Public Schools Research Evaluation Director, that didn't happen the first 6 months we worked with him. This was after a couple of years. And he was saying to us, keep giving us more. We're just going to eat this up because we are taking it, we are using it. They were making changes in their practices. And actually in Milwaukee Public Schools, just in the last year, we saw an amazing change in the results. But it was because they were taking information from the research, put it into practice, and we would continue to evaluate and see how it was effective. So it was because we had developed this partnership where we could have this two-way street communicating, here are our needs, here are what we need to know, here's what we can do, and sometimes also open up new doors for, like I said, better data, more collaboration to make possible some of the kind of analysis we're doing. And also, these collaboratives were cross-district. So our partners most loved when we would set up a webinar, we'd all talk together. Oh, we're having the same problem in Chicago. What are you doing in Dallas? Or Dallas says, why can't we do that in Chicago? I'm going to go talk to TA and say, we need to do that. We actually had a law change here in Texas to facilitate the school district here in Dallas to be able to do something that they were also doing in Chicago. So I'm going to stop and turn over to discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was really wonderful.